Hi, everybody. I wanted to welcome you here today. My name is Dr. Shana Weiss. I am the Associate Director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies, and we are thrilled that you are here with us today for this very special webinar with Dr. Yair Wallach. I'm going to introduce Dr. Wallach, and then I will pass it along to him. And at the end, I will come back up and we will have time for questions. So at any time during the presentation, please feel free to put your questions in the chat and we will go back to them at the end. So without further ado, Yair Wallach is the Senior Lecturer in Israel Studies at SOAS. I don't know, do Londoners say SOAS or SOAS? Okay. University of London, where he is also head of the SOAS Center for Jewish Studies. He's a cultural and social historian of modern Palestine and Israel. He's published articles in Hebrew, Arabic, and English, on urban and visual culture, on Jewish-Arab relations. His book, A City in Fragments, Urban Text in Modern Jerusalem, was published by Stanford in 2020, and it looks at Arabic and Hebrew street texts, inscriptions, banners, graffitis, etc., in modern Jerusalem. He's also currently a Leverhulme Research Fellow, and his new project, which maybe we'll get time to talk about at the end, is called The Arab Ashkenazi, which looks at Jewish Ashkenazi acculturation in the Arab Levant. He's also published articles on Haaretz, Guardian, other media. I also have to say personally, he is an excellent Twitter follower, which is where I first encountered him and his work, so highly recommend it. And without further ado, I will pass it off to Dr. Wallach. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shana, for this introduction and for the invitation. I'm really honored to be here and to present. I'll be basically presenting my book through this chapter and through this talk on graffiti on the Western Wall. So let me, I'll upload my presentation because there's going to be lots of images. You can see the images, right? Yeah. Okay. So the story starts for me some years ago. I went to the Imperial War Museum in London, to their archive, and I knew that I was researching text in Jerusalem. But I didn't know quite what I was looking for, so they have a good archive of photographs of Jerusalem, early photographs and so forth. So I was just there kind of looking through images, and then I start seeing images of the Western Wall, and I see graffiti, like big letters, big names written on the Western Wall, and it's not just one image. It's there's lots of them, and my immediate reaction was, "What is this?" I mean, all these questions came. Who wrote these graffiti? Why did they write them? At what stage did they stop writing them? Who erased them? Because most of them, it's not what we see when we go to the wall today. So in what point was it banned? And maybe also why didn't I know about this? I mean, this is a very, very well-known site, a very important, the most important Jewish site, etc. How come? And these were images from 1920s. It's not it's not a long time ago. How come this seems to be completely forgotten? Okay, so these are the kind of questions that I started the research with, and I'll try to answer in this talk. And as I said, this is part of a larger project which resulted in my book, which is this book. It's called The City in Fragments, Urban Text in Modern Jerusalem. And it looks at various textual forms in the urban landscapes that in modern Jerusalem. There is from the middle of the 19th century more or less until 1948, primarily in Arabic and Hebrew, also some other languages as well, but mainly in Arabic and Hebrew. And I look at a variety of textual artifacts from stone inscriptions in Arabic and in Hebrew to adverts, to street nameplates, shop signs, signs on institutions, including textual artifacts that circulate like money, like visiting cards, like ID cards. And the idea was to look at all the kind of texts that are part of our everyday life and are not books and not newspapers, not something we sit kind of carefully to read, but somehow construct our life that we encounter them in urban situations. And the big question of the book is what is the kind of change that we can see in modern Jerusalem, specifically regarding Arabic and Hebrew? What happens? And I think an easy question, an easy answer is that, of course, the more the city becomes bigger and becomes more developed, we see more text around, right? And I think that's not surprising. And we'll see more kind of new text like adverts and shop signs and so forth. So in that sense, if we start in 1850, and if we imagine Jerusalem, we would naturally imagine that there's less text in the street than in 1940s. And that's kind of obvious. And we think of our own lives. Of course, you know, with the advent of digital technology, there's much more textuality in our life, okay? So the idea is that there's certain development, that there's more and more textual forms around to interact, read, write, and so forth. And that is all true. But what interests me is particularly examples of text which becomes obsolete, which become erased. So forms of textuality that are removed from our encounter becomes unacceptable. So it's not just a story of more text, but it's also kind of what kind of text we encounter and what kind of text becomes forbidden. And I think that's the interesting question, to understand the kind of change. It's not just more, it's also less in some ways. And to understand why what is the moment where graffiti becomes forbidden and why it's part of that story. And specifically in Hebrew, I mean, I think what we expect, and I think what, in the 20th century, with Zionism, with the Arab-Jewish, Zionist-Palestinian conflict, clearly Hebrew and Arabic become something of rival languages, and we'll touch about it in the talk. And we can point to examples, and Hebrew wins, to put bluntly. So there's various forms of Arabic that are removed or marginalized. Okay, so this is part of the story. But there's also some forms of Hebrew which are marginalized, and I think that's, for me, it's more interesting to focus on that. Not just about the fact that there's more Hebrew, but there's some forms of Hebrew which becomes not only are removed but are forgotten, erased from our cultural memory. So that's kind of the bigger context of where this fit into the book. So let's start with the question of what are these inscriptions and who wrote them and why and when. And the more I researched that, it became clear that writing Hebrew names as part of pilgrimage to Jewish holy sites is a very ancient tradition and a completely acceptable tradition that goes back to antiquity. It was, and there's a book, if you're interested, by Karen Stern, that's called Writing on the Wall, that looks specifically on the Roman Levant in Syria and Palestine and so forth, that looks at Hebrew inscriptions as part of pilgrimage, as part of ritual. So it's a very ancient tradition that really goes back at least 2,000 years. It's not a particularly Jewish tradition in the sense that it was also part of pagan ritual, pagan pilgrimage, and there's examples of Greek inscriptions from Greek holy sites and from Hellenistic holy sites and so forth in the Mediterranean. So it's not completely unique. And it's afterwards, we know it from various Jewish synagogues and holy sites, but we also see it in Muslim holy sites and Christian holy sites later. The idea is that part of pilgrimage is that the pilgrim writes their name either in paint, in the example we have around the Temple Mount are red paint or black paint, or really inscribed deep into the stones. And here you can see one example that actually survives, and you can see it still on the Western Wall today. And I think it's important to say that this is an act of ritual. It's an act of worship, if you want. It's not, and I think the difficulty is to disassociate this from how we normally think about graffiti today, which is an individualistic act of desecration, if you wish, or kind of marking, yourself in various places around the city in order to kind of commemorate yourself, aggrandize yourself, and so forth. And I think this is a very, very different thing when you think about these kinds of religious graffiti, which are, as I said, part of pilgrimage, which are specific to holy sites, rather than, it's not that Jewish pilgrims wrote their names everywhere on walls or on, furniture or and so forth. They wrote it at very, very specific places that were holy for them. In the case of Hebrew inscriptions, they chose deliberately the Hebrew language and to write in square script, which is particularly sacred. And so to that extent, this is about a ritual that is part of a congregational practice rather than individualistic practice, I would say. And we can see it also in accounts of this practice. For example, this is from Benjamin of Tudela, the itineraries of the famous Iberian Jewish traveler that traveled across the Mediterranean to the east. And he recounts his visit to Jerusalem around 1170, when the city was under the rule of the Crusaders. And he talks, and there's a description, I'm not going to go into great deal, he talks about a place which he identifies as the Western Wall, which is not the Western Wall which we identify today. It's actually probably it's where the Gates of Mercy are. So it's the eastern side of the Temple Mount. But he talks about immense stones. So this is part of that kind of wall, enclosure wall of the compound. And he says specifically that all Jews inscribe their name upon an adjacent wall. So it's not clear exactly where, but we are seeing a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, and Temple Mount involves writing your name on a wall which is identified at the time probably as the Western Wall, even though it's not the site we mark today. And if we continue reading his account, 2 pages later, he talks about the tomb, Rachel's tomb, which are 11 stones, which is a place where Jews stop on the way. And again, he says, every Jew who passes there inscribes his name on the stones of the monument. So this is really part of practice of holy sites. Now, I think what we have to remember that the overwhelming majority of Jewish holy sites at the time in Palestine were holy tombs. And it's true that we have a lot of accounts of visitors that describe how they write their names when they come to these tombs, whether it is the tomb of Samuel or Rachel or Huldah or Zechariah, and we have many examples, and also we have archaeological evidence that this is widely practiced. Okay, so in that sense, this is a very ancient custom, and what is maybe strange is not the custom, but the fact that it looks strange to us. I think that's the more interesting phenomenon. Now, the site that we mark as the Western Wall is venerated as such from the 16th century, when the Ottomans allowed Jews to pray there. And it was one of the sacred sites for Jews on pilgrimage and so forth. It's in the 19th century that it really gains importance and becomes the most important site for pilgrimage in Jerusalem. And it gains global importance with Jerusalem becoming more accessible to travelers, with the publication of accounts, and with the creation of a Judaica art market and a kind of Jewish visual culture that extend globally. And the image of the Western Wall is becomes a logo almost, one of those visual icons that are instantly recognizable to Jews, from Cochin to Algiers to Eastern Europe and so forth. It's a very, very used image, and it's this image, which is a very abstract motif. It's you can see here a kind of very geometrical rendering of the wall with the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque and these cypress trees above. And this is used on a variety of artifacts. Here you see it on a challah cover. But it really exists in so many forms. Now I think, and that's one of the things I think which makes the Western Wall so recognizable to Jews. Now I think what's interesting that this is an abstract illustration of the wall, and it's very different from how the wall looked in that period. And if you look at, this is the closest you could get to seeing something like this, but you can see that the wall was generally not visible in its entirety in the way that it's rendered here. And a lot of it is covered by the Mughrabi quarters, the Moroccan quarter, which was just in the vicinity of the wall. So, and especially you wouldn't see it when you approach a wall, you wouldn't see what you see here, you would see something quite different. So this is more an idea of the wall rather than actual representation. But in the late 19th century, we have also new kind of images which are circulating. I should say that you can see here in the map, and you can see that where it says the Wailing Place, that's very narrow alley is where pilgrims would have access to the wall. So it's a very, very narrow pavement which people would navigate through to the alleyways to get to that alleyway. And this is how it looked. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these images of pre-48, how the wall looked like. So these are realistic representation that start circulating either in paintings, this is a print, or in photographs, because there's a lot of interest with this site, and it's almost immediately photographed by Christian photographers. So it also circulates as such. And these photographers and painters were particularly interested by these inscriptions, and which clearly struck them as something slightly odd and strange. And this is one example. I think this is the only example I have of, this is documenting, so to speak, the practice of writing on the wall. And you can see here that this is an elaborate practice. This is not someone coming and kind of writing something and running away. No, this is something that is, a slow and quite meditated practice. Now, this is an image that was based on a painting by a Greek Ottoman painter called Theodore Rally. And this is from 1898, and he presents this in a Paris salon shortly afterwards. What is interesting is that Rally chooses to call, to explain this painting by saying that the Jews are writing a graffiti against the Dreyfus trial. So this is a political graffiti against the Dreyfus trial. Now, this is, in all certainty, this is nonsense. There's nothing to suggest that Jews practiced political graffiti in Jerusalem before the 1930s. I mean, there's no evidence, and all the evidence that we see from photographs are just names. So it's highly unlikely that Jews wrote graffiti about the Dreyfus trial on the Western Wall. But what is interesting is that that Rally sees a need to justify why Jews are doing this thing. And he kind of probably what he was familiar from Paris was political graffiti. So that's the explanation he gives to this. It's worth mentioning at the same time, this is the age of tourism to the Middle East. And there's lots of examples of Western tourists leaving graffiti and leaving their names on various ruins across the Middle East. It's usually their name and the date. And this is from the Abu Simbel temple in Egypt. And there's lots of evidence for that. I think, again, I would say this is a very, very different practice. I mean, I would say that this is tourism, and this is tourists kind of wanting to inscribe their presence. And I would say this is a colonial practice of Western visitors kind of establishing their ownership of these ruins and their superiority, if you wish. These are not holy sites for them, and that's very, very different from the Western Wall, where this is a site of pilgrimage. But in the mind of people that see the graffiti on the Western Wall and are not familiar with this practice, at this point, around the turn of the century, it's not so clear the difference between religious graffiti and new kind of graffiti. And I think that's something that we can see, for example, in this, again, this is a print, and this is by E.M. Lillian, which some of you may be familiar with. He was a fin de siècle Viennese artist, a Jewish artist that was associated with the Zionist movement. If you know the Herzl image in Basel looking on the river, that's Lillian. He took that picture. And he visited Jerusalem several times, and he took drawings and he made them into, he took etchings and he made them into prints and so forth. And this is one of them from 1910 of the Western Wall. And you can see that he was clearly interested in these inscriptions because they're instantly visible. What is interesting about this print is that you can see, I would say two things. On the one hand, you can see that the Hebrew above does not make any sense. It's not names. It's not recognizable as name. There's something cryptic about it. And I think maybe he tried to make it more mysterious. Maybe it seemed to him a bit strange that people just write their names. So he tried to make it something more enigmatic than just names. So that's one thing. But the other thing, you can see that at the bottom right, he writes his name on the wall. It says Ephraim Moshe Ben Yaakov HaKohen Lillian, and I hope you can see it in the image. So he did not actually write his name, but this is a kind of artist signature. So he puts his signature on the stones of the wall. So in a way, you can see this is a moment where the writing on the wall, which is a very specific Jewish practice in place, in situ, is kind of sucked into a circulating world of images that includes also artists' signatures, which is a very different kind of course, an artist's signature is a very different kind of text than Pilgrim's graffiti. But at this point, it's not really clear the difference between all of these things. And therefore, this, what I'm trying to say is that this practice becomes exposed on a global scale to people who didn't visit the wall and are not familiar with this. And at this historical point where graffiti becomes something not quite respectable and not quite appropriate, then we start seeing questions raised about this customs. And we can see it already in various, there's published in the local newspaper, Orthodox Hasidic newspaper in Jerusalem, a modernist Hasidic newspaper saying, this is inappropriate, we should stop this kind of custom, it's wrong. So you can see that this custom is starting to gain some kind of interest, but also criticism. Now, okay, now here I would like to kind of introduce the question of Zionism and the Zionist approach to the Western Wall, and through the quote from Herzl diaries. Now, Herzl visits the Western Wall in 1898, and he is not impressed with what he sees. This is from his diary. He says, any deep emotion is rendered impossible by the hideous, miserable, scrambling beggary pervading the place. And Herzl is not unique in that sense. When we read accounts by Zionists visiting the wall in around the turn of the century, they are extremely uncomfortable with the site. It usually starts, there's description of them navigating through the alleyways of the old city, and it smells and it's dark, and there's all these kind of too many colors, and they don't, it's too much, and they don't see anything, and suddenly they turn a corner in this alleyway, and suddenly they see the wall. It's quite a striking look, and that's usually what people observe. But it's also a very, it's popular practice. It's it's a very it's a very physical encounter. People scream, people cry. There's lots of poor people. There's lots of beggars, and for someone like Herzl, you can see how he feels alienated from this experience. He's extremely uncomfortable, and that kind of repeats in other descriptions. So on the one hand, there's kind of cultural difference in the sense that there's a disconnect between them and the worshiping crowd. But also there's something deeper, that, this is a site that commemorates ruin. It's a site that is the ruin of the temple. That's the meaning of the site. It embodies the ruin of the temple. So it's a site of ruin. And Zionism is, it's about revival, rebuilding. So on the one hand, this is the most important Jewish site. It's very well known. Of course, they're interested in this site. But whatever they do with it, it will remain a site of ruin. They're not interested in building the temple, right? I mean, at least these people are not. So how to incorporate a symbol, a place that is so much about destruction, and it's existential destruction. It's not just it's about the end of the temple marks something for Judaism, which the Zionist movement cannot fundamentally change in a way. It can rebuild, in many ways, but not that. So that is a certain contradiction that they grapple with, and I think they negotiate it with a sense of uneasiness. There's a lot of talk about we need to reclaim this site, we need to clean it up, we need to make it a proper monument, we need to control and discipline and regulate this site. We cannot allow it to be this kind of mishmash of people crying and just kind of, we have to, there's something really, there's a deep unease about how this place looks and how this place is experienced. And I think there's a fascinating article by Arya Sapochnik that talks about how little the Western Wall is used as a visual symbol by Zionists up until 1930s. And if it's used to mark ruin, and it's usually contrasted with some new construction, like Bezalel School, or like some colonies, or like Tel Aviv. So it's the old and the dead, the Western Wall, and Zionism will not be the Western Wall. It will be something different, okay? So that is a certain contradiction that is there, and it's and it's often externalized in unease about the practices that are connected to the site, the kind of the mourning rituals, and the way that it's not regulated. And one of the symptoms of not being regulated is the fact that people write their names on the wall. Now, this comes to a head around 1929, and the 1929 riots, which are, of course, a very important moment in the history of Palestine, Israel, if you want to know more, I warmly recommend Hillel Cohen's book 1929, which is really a fantastic book about the riots and how they're seen from different sides. The riots of 1929 start in various confrontations around practices at the Western Wall. It's this guy that we can see here, Joseph Klausner, intellectual and a professor in the Hebrew University, which publishes a public call. He sets up the pro-Western Wall committees, and that's around disagreements about certain practices that the British authorities banned, like bringing benches or like making separation between Jews and women. So he publishes this call all around the country, and then there's Jewish demonstration marching to the wall, singing a tikva, and that afterwards leads to a riot that escalates to the riots of 1929, which is a very traumatic and tragic moment with attacks of Jewish communities in Hebron and Safed and so forth. And Klausner is a very interesting character because his first encounter with the wall is very, very interesting, and I talk a lot about this in the book. This is the first encounter in 1912, where he talks about, he mentioned the inscriptions, he doesn't like the inscriptions, and he doesn't like the way the Jews behave there, and it's a very interesting account. But in 1929, he doesn't like the way that Arabs behave towards Jews. It's not the Jews anymore, it's the Arabs that become the problem. Now, after 1929, there's several investigation committees by the British Mandate to establish what to do next. And one of them is League of Nations Commission of Inquiry that is headed by a Swedish guy. And the British basically say, look, we need to figure out what to do in terms of what practices to allow and to ban in the Western Wall. We are committed to the status quo. This is the principle that guides our policy towards holy sites in Palestine. But we want to have, this is a League of Nations mandate, the Palestine mandate, and we give the question to the League of Nations to decide what would be the correct interpretation. So there is a League of Nations commission, and they come and they interview various people, and they visit the site, and they look at various practices that relate to the Western Wall. Now, one of these practices is the writing, as the graffiti, is the writing of names, Jewish names in Hebrew on the Western Wall. Now, for the Jewish attorneys that represent the Zionist case in front of the commission, the graffiti are really important. They are proof of not quite ownership, because there's an agreement, consensus that nominally this place is owned by a Muslim Waqf Abu Madian. But Jews have right of use in this because they've used it for centuries. And I'm not going to read the entire quote, but they say look, this is a very, very ancient custom. And it's not something, some kind of, boys write their names and run away. No, this is something that people do with paint and ink and, incise in the face of the stone. And they say, look, sometimes people bring ladders and with chisels, they mark their names onto the wall. So clearly, and there's no objections. The Muslims never said anything. So clearly that proves the Jews have certain rights over this. This is a Jewish site. And what could prove it better than the fact that Jews have for centuries inscribed and incised their names on the scroll. And so they see it that it's recognized. But the fact that Muslims never intervened, we can see it as a kind of territorial mark that marks that this is a Jewish site, and it shows sacred veneration, which they hold the wall. But this is a bit of a problematic argument for the Zionist attorneys, because in 1930, to say proudly, look, we write graffiti on the place that is very sacred to us, that doesn't sound quite right, because this sounds disrespectful. This sounds like a sacrilege. This sounds like somebody defacing a holy site rather than venerating a holy site. So they're very keen to emphasize in the closing speech, saying, for us, to our modern taste, this is inappropriate, and we've already said that we should stop doing this. So on the one hand, this is something that is a very important Jewish custom. On the other hand, they want to distance themselves from it, say, we don't do that anymore because we know that's not appropriate. We don't see it as an appropriate kind of thing anymore. This is David Yelin's speech. And interestingly, when we come to the British authorities, the British are very perplexed what to do about it, because status quo is say, let's keep things as they are. And we know that this custom of inscription is very ancient. So by keeping the status quo, do we allow people to write their names? But status quo also means keeping visually the place as it is. And if we allow people to write, then this changes how the place looks. So what does exactly status quo means here? And they decide that on the one hand, the law of antiquities means that no one can write on the wall anymore, but they will not remove any writing because once it's on the stone, it cannot be removed. At this point, I should say that somebody in all this confusion, somebody removed most of the painted inscriptions, and the Zionist attorneys blame more or less the Arab side for doing it as a way to kind of discredit Jewish rights over the site. Finally, the Muslim attorneys in front of the commission, they also say that this is an inappropriate custom, that this is a part of a Jewish attempt to take over the site, and it's kind of one step, and the next thing they want is the Temple Mount and the Dome of the Rock, and therefore they see it as a territorial mark that has to be resisted. And they're very keen, saying no more new inscription on the wall. So I think what we see here is a very interesting consensus at this point by Jewish Orthodox rabbis, from the Agudat Israel, by Zionist representatives, by British officials, and by the Muslim representatives of the Supreme Muslim Council. They all agree that this custom has to stop. The only people that don't get the memo is the pilgrims. The pilgrims keep writing their names on the wall throughout the 30s, but now they get arrested, and some of them are sent to prison. But when the rabbi of the wall, and by now there's an official rabbi of the wall, he talks about this with the police officer, and he says, by all means, arrest these people. I mean, we cannot allow this anymore. We are against this. And we see notices by the chief rabbinate in the early 40s, and they list a long list of things that shouldn't be done. you shouldn't bring pets to the Western Wall, you shouldn't come on motorcycle, shouldn't take pictures on Shabbat, but you also can't write and draw on the wall. Which, I mean, I think the interesting thing is that within a decade, what has been described as an ancient custom of veneration becomes something that is out of the question and seems just a very strange thing to do and an inappropriate thing to do to all the parties involved in this, while they are in complete disagreement about the meaning and what should be done about this site in any other way. So I'll end with, and this is the wall how it looks today after the destruction of the Maghrabi quarter in '67, and there's a long plaza, and that kind of looks much closer to the abstract representation of the wall that we've seen before. And I want to say a few words about the custom, the textual custom that we associated with the wall, which are the little piece of paper that people write the wishes and place between the stone. And this is kind of seen as the thing you do par excellence. And you can see various, if you search on Google Images, various long lists of celebrities placing notes between the stones of the Western Wall. Now, this is an Ashkenazi custom that started in the late 19th century in Jerusalem. Sephardic Jews found it quite strange and funny. Why would Ashkenazi Jews write their names, write their kind of little wishes and places between the wall? And they used to joke about it with their Arab Muslim neighbors. But by the 1930s, it became kind of canonized as the example. And I think we can see, of course, the difference between these two textual customs, that, of course, when you write graffiti, you leave a mark that cannot be easily removed. So it's a very physical, tactile encounter. While the notes are something that you can hide, you can remove, it doesn't change the nature of the site. And it's part of this process of regulating this site and part of, I would say also, its transformation from a sacred site of popular veneration to a national monument in a way that has to be much more controlled in terms of how people engage with it. I'll just end with, I'll say, kind of conclusions from this, what I take from this. And one thing is the transformation of Hebrew. What is, until the late 19th century, the presence of Hebrew in public space is very much connected to Jewish congregational practices and its sacred meaning, and becomes a national language and a territorial language. And it's part of seen as a territorial claim. For our Palestinians, it's seen as a part of colonizing agenda and putting Hebrew there, which they didn't mind in the 19th century, but when Hebrew changes, it becomes part of the war between these two languages over territory. And that is something that we can see in the transformation of both these languages into national arrival languages. And Hebrew assumes a colonizing nature of taking over territory and changing its meaning. And the second thing I would say is how the different approaches to writing and materiality, the idea that the natural way in which Jewish pilgrims thought there's nothing wrong with marking your name in this place and engaging in a tactile way with the site, it's definitely very different from the modern way in which text is regulated and detached, and the idea of kind of textual engagement with the urban environment is seen as something that is inappropriate. And I'll stop here. I'll stop and so we can have time for questions.
Thank you so much, Yair. That was fascinating and really interesting. I'm reminded of a friend who did research on post-World War II Polish Jews who stayed after the Holocaust, and she found secret files from the Polish police trying to figure out what were in the Kvitlach, right? What were in the notes that people put in graves to the Rebbe. They, with conspiratorial minds, the Polish authorities dreamt that it might be some sort of worldwide communication system to slip secret notes from Jews to other Jews. They finally found someone, I guess they found a token Jew to come decode them. And when he told them they were just names, this person should get married, this person should be well, the Polish authorities actually didn't believe him until they found a second person. So it just, there's such fascinating history here. And your presentation does such a good job of showing how paying attention to these things that often we usually ignore, right, can show such a rich history. So we have so many questions. I will try and get to as many as possible. And the first one, I would say, came in from a personal mentor and teacher, and a question I had as well, which is the question of gender, right? Do women get to write on the walls, right? How are they involved in this? What is going on here with this practice, and how maybe that's reflected in other parts of your book as well?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think women wrote their names. I mean, the names that I can see are male names. I think I'm not completely sure, but I think primarily Sephardic. So I think it's primarily Sephardic and Middle Eastern Jews who did this practice rather than Ashkenazi ones. The names I can see are Sephardic names. Sometimes they mention the name of the mother. So there are female names on the wall, but I think these are, Ephraim, son of Rosa, rather than Rosa herself writing her name. But so I think it's unlikely that that women wrote their names. We do find a lot of in stone inscriptions, in dedication inscriptions on Jewish institutions in Jerusalem, as a very large share of women named. So a lot of institutions are named after or commemorate women rather than men. That's really a really interesting aspect of it. But not these, as far as I can tell.
Right, and it makes sense, in traditional sort of Jewish prayer, if a man is including a woman's name, it's usually an indication that it's some sort of request for something, right? Often for healing or that sort of thing, as opposed to the male name, as opposed to, son of father so-and-so, which is usually used for being called up to the Torah or something like that. So that's really interesting. We have questions, we got a question about the use of Eretz Yisrael, right? Especially in sort of official mandate Palestine signage, right? Like often, someone mentioned in your book cover, right? It says Palestina, and then you have Eretz Yisrael. So how does that language, especially in the Hebrew usage, develop? How does it coexist with the English? Sort of what's going on there with that designation?
It's a long story, but what happens? I mean, I think the British in 1920, the Herbert Samuel, when the first High Commissioner arrives, making Hebrew a state language is one of his priorities. And it's one of the things he does instantly, that is to include Hebrew on official notices. And it's kind of putting facts on the ground in a way, because this is still a moment of confusion. And he wants to send a message of British commitment to the Balfour Declaration through the inclusion of Hebrew as one of the three languages of Palestine. And it's within days, he issues a reprint of stamps with three languages, which says Palestine, Philistine in Arabic, and in Hebrew, Palestina, Eretz Israel. So Eretz Israel appears in brackets. And that's a kind of compromise, because at this point, he's a bit worried about implications. So it's his decision to say, well, let's call it Palestina, which is a transliteration, but we have Eretz Israel in brackets, which is a kind of compromise which no one was happy with. And that's something that is a constant source of conflict during the mandate. Any public reference to Eretz Israel is something that Zionists were very much interested in, and Palestinians were very unhappy about, our Palestinians. But I mean, the inclusion of Hebrew here is not a neutral, reflection of, some kind of multicultural linguistic policy. It's really part of the commitment to the Balfour Declaration and the Jewish national home. And there's more I can say about it, but I think in this context, I think that's enough.
Yeah. I'm going to take the liberty to ask one of my own questions. And I was thinking about it when you were talking about the British forbidding the graffiti and what that means. So are these texts, right, are they about regulating the spaces and sort of what the wall looks like, or is it about regulating people's behavior, right? We want people who come to the wall to sort of behave in a dignified way. And maybe it's true for both, and maybe there are other examples, but I'm just wondering about those tensions between regulating bodies and regulating spaces, which is a big interest in my own work as well.
I think it's more about, I would say it's both, but basically the British are very, very interested in text in our urban space. There's lots of examples of, and especially I compare it with the Ottoman authorities, they are very, very interested in regulating population and space through signs, signage, and so forth, street names and so forth. But they are also worried about text out of control. So for them, it's a tool, it's a official tool of intervention, but it's also something that has to be regulated. And they don't like the idea of people writing stuff, outside their control. Generally, I would say, but specifically not in a place which proved so explosive. So here, it's about regulating bodies in the sense that, we want to make sure that any kind of engagement is under control, but they know that any new inscriptions could create some kind of backlash. And it does. The Muslims do complain about what they see as new inscriptions in several occasions. I mean, the chapter after this chapter, I talk about the banners of Nabi Musa, which is cloth banners of part of a Muslim pilgrimage, which is also a kind of text, ritual text. And also there, you can see that the British are very, very worried about how these texts circulate, how these banners are used. And they're very obsessed with controlling their appearance and when they are allowed to be shown and when they are not. So both, I mean, I think the concern and anxiety about how people behave in space is expressed through trying to regulate objects and, in this case, architecture, if you wish.
Right, so I think we have time for maybe one, we'll see two more questions. We got a couple of questions about, the textual politics, right, of Jerusalem today, right? We didn't talk so much about the present, but, graffiti and what that has today and the role of these politics. I'm thinking specifically of certain areas in Meir Sharim, right, where you'll see graffiti that says this is Palestinian territory. Are there other examples like that, and what other ways do graffiti and politics still impact, or these urban texts still impact the life of Jerusalem today, for its residents?
It's a big question. I mean, graffiti changed its meaning. I mean, it's become closer to, like elsewhere in the world. I think it is still very interesting that in Israel, in general, graffiti is different from the graffiti you see in Europe or North America in some ways. It's much more textual. It's much less visual. You know, it's less paintings and so forth. It's much more about actual text. It's more religious. I'm thinking of, you know, Nachman from Uman that you can see all over Israel. There is a religious form of graffiti which is very different from anything you'll see in London, right? And the same is true for Muslim graffiti and Muslim texts, etc. But it also has a political, secular dimension. And on the Palestinian side, it's become, you know, the first intifada is where graffiti becomes the medium of communication. And the other thing about graffiti, I would say, is that people are less, and the authorities are less bothered about graffiti in Israel than they are in North America and in the UK. So of course, if there's graffiti that, you know, people don't like, it will be removed for political reasons. But the idea that graffiti in itself is an affront, is something that is so deeply inappropriate, is not so, it's far less strong in Israel. And I think it's partly because it's such a textual culture, and that's something that's still, you know, it's still very much there. More broadly speaking, I think there's a lot of politics about the regulation of language in space. There's questions around street names and naming of places, which is very, you know, rages around signage. A lot of it is about the removal of Palestinian names from the landscape, or when it comes to the name of Jerusalem is the kind of the official Israeli name in Arabic for Jerusalem, or Shalim al-Quds, is a name that Palestinians do not like because you know, they see it as part of Israeli taking over Jerusalem, and there's and also on the ground there's a lot of you know, Arabic is routinely erased on signage in Jerusalem. There's there's a photo essay that was published not long ago in 972, which shows that systematically Arabic on street names, even when it's very Zionist names that just appear in Arabic, the Arabic is erased by people who just do not want to see the Arabic there. And it's also true to some extent in the Old City in Jerusalem, in some parts that Hebrew is removed because residents see it as an occupying language, and therefore they don't like it to see it in their spaces. So that's you know, these kind of politics still play, but they play in a very different context than what I describe in my book, which is the late Ottoman and the British Mandate period, which kind of anticipates some of these things, but still operate in different political reality.
Thank you so much, Yair, for an amazing presentation. Thank you everyone who participated with us today. I encourage you to check out our website. We have tons of events coming up in the next couple of months, ranging from Armenian pottery and the story, another one about the history of Jerusalem, to partnerships with the Boston Jewish Film Festival, Natan Sharansky is speaking with us, and others. Again, thank you so much all for coming. Thank you for Yair, and we will see you next time. Have a good day.